Welcome to Class 7 for BRITE Old Testament 506, Hebrew Exegesis. We've got two syntactical topics to cover this morning, so let's go ahead and jump in. Today we're going to be looking at syntax, which we have defined as the way that words go together. We have examined words themselves and done word studies on how to determine the dictionary form of a word and the word usage in context, but we also have to keep in mind that syntax will nuance our interpretation of a verse, how the words in that verse or clause hold together. Today we're going to be looking at two particular topics of syntax: verb syntax, that is the use of consecutives, the vayiktol, which is the yiktol imperfect, plus a vav with the patak and the dagesh forte in that first root letter, that tells us that we're dealing with a vayiktol, which would typically translate as past rather than present or future as in the yiktol. We also have vakatal, which looks like vav plus a katal, and does not have a form that differentiates it from a normal vav plus a katal, although typically a vakatal form will be first in the clause or first in the verse, helping us realize that we are dealing with a consecutive form here. We're also going to be dealing with noun syntax, talking about the construct creation. We have looked at construct in several instances in elementary Hebrew, typically translating it, the second word, the absolute noun within the construct chain, as of, so that the phrase might be city of Chicago, with city using the construct form in construct with Chicago, city of Chicago. But this is not the only usage of the construct clause, so we'll be looking at some other syntactical possibilities. One of the usages of the vayiktol consecutive is temporal succession. That is, events that take place successively or one after each other. So here in 1 Kings 12, 17 to 18, we read Vayimlok, he reigned, Rehoboam reigned over the people, and then consecutively, or afterwards, Vayishlach, he sends Adoram, who goes to the people, except that the people, after he has been sent, Vayirgamu, they stone him. And then after they stone him, Vayamot, he dies. One thing that's interesting about this is that after he dies, we have hit ametz la'alot, which is he hurried to get up, this is Rehoboam, hurried to get up in his chariot, except that it is not a vayiktol form here, but it is a yiktol. So even though the vav is at the beginning of that clause, vahamelech Rehoboam, we have Rehoboam hurrying as an imperfect, but still consecutive to the he died of Adoram. So here we have a chain of vav consecutives, and then a yiktol form being used also as a consecutive, but without the vav. So we understand that these are temporally successive. They take place one after another until the verse concludes. Occasionally, the temporal succession of vayiktols will be interrupted by parentheticals, and yet after the parenthetical, the temporal succession will pick up right where it left off. So we have an aside here in Numbers chapter 12, verses 2 through 4, where we read that Moses was very meek, more than all the men which were upon the face of the earth, which takes place in the middle of the succession of them, that is Aaron and Miriam, saying, Vayomaru, saying, does the Lord only speak through Moses? And after they have spoken, the Lord hears it, Vayishma Adonai. We then have the parenthetical statement, but then, after the end of the parenthetical statement, the Lord speaks again, Vayomer Adonai, and picks up simply where we have left off in the story. They said, God hears, then God says, all in succession, indicated by these vav consecutives. And then we have that parenthetical statement introduced by the vav, vahayish, right in the middle, which interrupts it in terms of how it's written, but not in terms of how it's translated. The temporal succession continues. Even though we call it a vav consecutive, it's important to remember that vav consecutives can be used in other ways besides temporal succession. For instance, here in Genesis 1:3, a vav consecutive actually opens the verse, Vayomer. This is not really consecutive because there's no action that came before this that verse 3 is consecutive to. Verses 1 and 2 lay the stage and summarize what happens in creation. Verse 3 begins the process of unpacking what exactly happened in creation and telling us the individual details. So there's nothing consecutive in verse 3, even though we open with a consecutive form. So we might translate this as now God said, rather than and God said, as though he'd done something previous. A vayikol plus a katal can be used to indicate simultaneous action, so that we have vayikra simultaneous as kara, a vayikol and a katal. At the same time that God called the light day, he also called the darkness night. Again, not consecutive, but simultaneous. It's also possible for us to have consecutives being used not temporally but logically. So here in Psalm 80, verse 9, God clears the ground and causes it to take root, and because he caused it to take root, it fills the whole earth. So the emphasis is not so much upon timing as it is upon cause and effect, a logical consecutive rather than a temporal consecutive. In some instances, vayiktols are not used for consecutive action, either temporal or logical. Instead, vayiktols are used to give an explanation of something else in the verse, sometimes what we call the exegetical usage, explaining more details. So here we are told that we know something about Joab, and then we are told through a series of vayiktols what it is that we know, so that he killed and put and avenged the blood of his brother and murdered the commanders of the armies of Israel, both Abner and Amasa. And you can see that these are done in a series of vayiktols. Vayahargem, Vayasem, and then again at the end, Vayitten. These are all indicating what it is that Joab did, but they all fall under that previous verb, you know, yadati. Then we know what it is that we know, and we can explain it using these vayiktol forms as consecutives. He did this, 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 and this. Sometimes the consecutive is used not to give explanation and not exegetically, not used to indicate succession. Sometimes it's used to indicate expansion. So here we're told in Numbers 22:11 that the people have come out of Egypt and covered the surface of the land. The point is not that they have vayakas, covered the surface of the land, consecutive to having come out of Egypt, even though that obviously makes sense, but the fact that when they came out of Egypt, they covered the land. These two are simultaneous, but not even simultaneous. In some ways, they're the same action, coming out of Egypt and covering the land. They're parallel statements. And the vayiktol here indicates not a succession or not even a consequence, but a further expansion of what it means that they came out. Although very similar to the idea of expansion, we also have the vayiktol being used as extension or supplemental action. These are actions that are being done somewhat concurrently, and yet they are logically the part of the same action. So here in Genesis 28:6, Isaac is blessing Jacob, but he's also commanding Jacob. The two are part of the same process as he sends Jacob off to Padan Aram. And so we might translate this as he blessed him, he commanded him, understanding that they are taking place together. In addition to the vayiktol form, we also have a vakatal form, where the vav plus the katal is used. If it follows an imperfect, the vakatal form is often used to indicate repeated action, such as Genesis 2:6, that tells us that a mist went up from the earth and watered all the face of the earth. The fact that the perfect is being used here following the imperfect, vaya'aleh, is telling us that this continually happened. It continually watered, vahishka, continually watered all the face of the earth, rather than a consecutive action or even that exegetical or supplemental action as part of the same process that we saw with the vayiktol. This is telling us that it continually happened again and again and again, going up from the earth and watering all the face of the earth. Here in Isaiah chapter 6, we might expect a usage of the vayiktol, that expansion or supplemental action to the participle that we saw in Genesis chapter 28 with Isaac blessing Jacob. Here again we have a participle, omadim, standing, and yet when we get to the place where we would expect the vayiktol, instead we have a vakatal, and he called to one another, vakara. This use of the vakatal form is a continuation of the action, similar to the usage of the vayiktol, but here using that vakatal form instead. The purpose of the vokatol form instead of the vayiktol is again indicating a continuation of the action of the standing, but it's not that he stood one time and called one time, but as they continued to stand, they continued to call. Whereas the supplemental action in Genesis 28 was, as he blessed him one time, he commanded him one time. So the use here of the perfect carries that idea of continuation, ongoing action. Two final usages of the vokatol to note often come after volitionals, so that we might have a successive idea, that is, that the vokatol, or the conversive or consecutive vav on the katal perfect, continues the action of the volitional. So here in Genesis 31, verse 44, we have a cohortative, nikrata, let us make, let us cut a covenant, and vahaya, let it be, as a witness between you and between me. So we have the vakatal form continuing the force of the cohortative, let it be, rather than just simply it will be. There's also a logical succession to the volitionals, so that here we have the tishvaru, you will buy, almost a force of an imperative, buy meat from them with the silver, but then that succession in terms of logic, that you might eat, vayakaltem, indicating that once you have bought the meat with the silver, you can eat it. And so we have the vakatal form in a consecutive relationship to that original imperfect, buy meat from them. Well, that closes our discussion of the syntax of the consecutives. Again, the point of this has just been to point out that consecutives are used not just for temporal succession or consecutive action, but are used in several other ways, both in the vayiktol and the vakatal form. With that in mind, let's move on to the construct form of nouns. In elementary Hebrew, we learned that Hebrew nouns do not decline. That is, that they don't have declensions, nominative, accusative, genitive, and dative. Instead, it is the syntax of the sentence that indicates how the particular noun is being used. In order to create a genitive, most often translated with that word of, we have to use the construct relationship in Semitic nouns. So here, for instance, in the first example, Isaiah 53:4, we have stricken of God, Mukeh Elohim. This is telling us, again, the relationship between these two words is a genitive relationship, and we can translate it with the word of. However, in many cases, the word of is not sufficient. In fact, in many cases, the word of is not even accurate. And that is because we have many different usages of the genitive in Hebrew. And so the purpose of these next few slides is just simply to make you aware of the fact that we can't simply leave everything as of. We need to stop and consider what is the relationship between the two nouns. So here in Isaiah 53:4, we have an agency, by, stricken by God. In Genesis 24:30, we have the idea of authorship, that these are the words of Rebekah, possession perhaps, but also the fact that she is the agent of, or the author of, these words. They are her words. We also have an instrumental use, similar to the word by, but might be better to translate as the word with, such as Isaiah 1:7, that you were burned with fire. Again, not so much an agent or a author as much as it is an instrument, what somebody else used to burn something. We also have an intention in Psalm 44:2, to be. So this is sheep of the slaughter, but really this is meant to be like sheep to be slaughtered. What it is that's going to happen to them. They're going to be slaughtered. So here's 4 usages of the genitive that don't use the word of. It's also possible for genitives to be used temporally, such as here in Genesis 41:50, the year of the famine, although really the genitive is just describing what year, explaining what Shana is, telling us what year it was. It was the year of the famine, so what kind of year. We also have a possession, raglav, his feet, because we remember that possessive pronouns attach to the construct form of the noun. Instead of regal, we have raglav, which is the construct form of regal with the 3ms possessive pronoun attached, feet of him, his feet. We can also use a genitive to indicate relationship. such as the fact that Yahweh is the God of Israel, which is a very common phrase in the Old Testament. Not just that Israel's God is Yahweh, but that Yahweh is the one who is God over Israel. So it's indicating the relationship between God and Israel. We can also have a material use of the genitives, so silver of vessels or vessels of silver. We have actually flipped the construct here, so instead of silver of vessels, it's actually vessels of silver, and we'll see how that works on the next slide. But the indication here is that it is material, that these vessels are made of silver, so silver vessels. We also have a partitive use, where the word part here, helkat, in the construct, is being used to describe the field. So this is part of the field belonging to Boaz. So again, 5 more usages of the genitive where of is not the best translation. The most common form of the construct is the attributive use, where the first noun in the construct chain is described in some way by the second noun in the construct chain. So here in Exodus 4:10 we read that this is an ish davarim, a man of words. Man comes first, but is described by the second noun, indicating what kind of man, a man of words. But we can also flip it the other way, so that we have attributed, where the first noun in the construct phrase actually adds information to the absolute, or the second noun in the construct phrase. So here in Exodus 32:9, it's literally stiff of neck, but it means stiff neck, where the first noun is describing the second. Stiff describes neck. This was the case on the previous slide, where the word silver came in the construct before the word vessels. This was not silver of vessels, but vessels of silver, an attributed use. We also have a topical use of the genitive, such as Nahum 1:1, an oracle of Nineveh, about Nineveh, not an oracle that started in Nineveh, not an oracle that belongs to Nineveh, but an oracle about Nineveh. Isaiah 1:4 talks about kind, so we have a seed of evil, which tells us this means evil children. This is another common usage of the genitive, just indicating what kind is being described. And then we have a superlative use in Song of Songs 1, Shir HaShirim, indicating that this is not just the Song of Songs, this is the best of songs, telling us that this song obviously is better than any other song. So again, several more usages of the genitive in the construct phrase that are best understood either without the word of or nuanced even with the word of. Finally, let me indicate some adjectival or adverbial usages of the construct construction. Here in Isaiah 53:5, we have the punishment of peace, but it's really meant to indicate the punishment that brought us peace, the effect describing the punishment. We also in Jeremiah 50 verse 28 have an advantage, the vengeance for his temple, not just vengeance of the temple as though the temple was taking vengeance, but describing what the vengeance was for. Joshua 15:15 uses the construct phrase to indicate location, so that we have the inhabitants of Debir or the inhabitants from Debir. And Ezekiel 41:12 indicates a goal using the construct phrase, so that we have the way of the sea, which is really supposed to be understood as the way to the sea, that is, west. So here again we have some additional usages of the construct phrase that are not translated by of, but are better translated in other ways. Well, that brings us to the end of this week's lecture. As with previous lectures, my goal has just been to expand those categories that you discovered in elementary Hebrew so that you see that Vav consecutives are used in ways other than consecutive, and that you understand that the construct is used in ways other than just simply of. You don't have to memorize all these, just be aware of them as you're translating, that you don't have to translate everything woodenly as of or as a consecutive form, but examine the syntax of the sentence to figure out the proper context of the usage of the word. I will see you in class. Be sure to do your vocabulary and to prepare your passage for the next class meeting.